Hello and welcome to episode 319 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Good. It's really good, actually. We've had another week of hectic work. We seem to be producing so much content at the moment, which is incredible to see, covering all sorts of areas of finance. And there's so many of us in the team now. It's brilliant to see. We were talking the other day, weren't we, when we were working during the office hours, seeing how many people were on the site writing articles at the same time. You have to think, going back all those years where it was just me, and see the team that's grown into what it is. It's amazing. And actually somebody wrote in about it, which is another reason why I reflect upon it, who was saying how it's great to see the team that we've built over time and the information that we give to people out there, particularly on investing. And they even likened me to the Martin Lewis of investing, which I think is I suppose let's take that as a nice compliment. So that was quite good to see. So yeah, I'm buzzing. It's been another great week at Money to the Masses.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're talking about people getting in contact, we got an email from Ben, didn't we, about a particular app that he's downloaded that he thinks brilliant.
Yeah, we talked about this probably a very long time ago in the early days of the Money to the Masses podcast, and it even featured, I'm sure it featured in the original book that I did on the 30-day money plan. But last week on the show, I talked about the importance of doing things and not procrastinating and trying to optimize your time and be efficient in what you do. And he talked about in his email about an app called WeQueue for You, which is an app you can use. You call whoever you're calling, say it's the tax man, it's the utility company. You call them via the app, and as soon as you get into the queue that you inevitably do when you call any of these companies, then you can use the app. The app will go on hold for you. You can get on with your day and go off and effectively put the phone down. Then the app will call you back when it's your turn in the queue, when you've got to the top of the queue and your call's being answered. And so that way it was feeding off of the idea I said, why not make those calls while you're going for a walk to optimize your time? In theory, you can get on with anything if you use something like that. So it was called WeQueue for You. It's actually, I've not seen much about it for quite a long time, but it's still out there. People are still using it and seemingly giving it some decent reviews. So it might be worth having a look at that if you are at all interested. And before we go on to what's on the show, one other thing I just wanted to talk about was Bitcoin and gold. On episode 317, I talked about that interaction between the price of gold, the price of Bitcoin, and inflation expectations and yields. This week, we've had some brilliant examples of what I was talking about occurring. So we saw gold break higher above the $1,800 per ounce level. But we also saw Bitcoin start to fall, and it was a reflection of the fact that inflation expectations are going up, but bond yields aren't going up at the same time. So that means that real yields are technically falling, which is a good thing for gold. And there was a bit of a risk-off sentiment at times this week, which was a negative for Bitcoin. Do you remember we talked about Bitcoin doing very well in an environment, even if yields are rising and inflation expectations are rising? So it was just quite nice to see when you talk about something, and if people have been looking at their app on their phone, the stock app, and been following those prices, start to see, oh, do you know what? I've seen this in action. It does happen. So it's quite nice to see that in the wild, as it were. So if you've not seen it, do follow it on your app. You might see those price movements. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to episode 317.
Okay, so that brings us on nicely to what is coming up on this week's show, episode 319. What have we got coming up this week?
So one of the pieces is inspired by a question that we got sent in, and it's about the asset allocation across your entire portfolio, your wealth. So if you have an ISA, a SIP, should they be invested differently or all the same? So I just wanted to give some thoughts on that, because it's a very valid question, actually, a very good question. We're going to talk about some lessons of money, how to get rich, and some steps to follow. And there's a very good book that is very popular in our Facebook community. If you're not part of the Facebook community, go to facebook.com/groups/money to the masses to join. Many people in that group love the book, The Richest Man in Babylon. So I'm going to take some of the lessons from that, because I do think people should still read the book or listen to the audio version, because there's some great lessons in it. It's quite an enjoyable money book. Most money books are very dry, but I'll come on to that. But there's some good lessons that people can take. And the final piece, Andy, you're going to do on debt.
That's right. The government has announced a new scheme. It's called the Breathing Space Scheme. So I'm just going to cover off a few points, what it is, who it can help, and exactly why this is good news for people who are struggling, particularly with problem debt and actually mental health issues that are related to that debt.
Perfect. So let me kick off with the piece about the asset allocation across your entire investment portfolio. Now, I got a question in from a reader, which I'm going to read out anonymously. But the question says, I have a question regarding SIPs and stocks and shares ISA. I have both and have very similar holdings in both. I invest in funds with regular contributions. The funds I buy into seem to be the same for both. These are funds that I've researched as good funds for the medium to long term. However, now I'm thinking, is it a good idea to have the same investments in both? Am I increasing risk and not diversifying enough? And should there be a different approach and strategy for the two types of investments? So it's a very valid and interesting question, and something that I probably haven't covered before on the podcast. So I thought we'd talk around the topic today. So generally speaking, the two different things that we've described there, a pension and a stocks and shares ISA, operate in slightly different ways. They're tax wrappers. So with a pension, it's a long-term investment. You can't access it at the moment until you're age 55. Any money going in gets tax relief on those pension contributions, so you get a nice boost from the tax man effectively, but you are taxed on the money you take out at the back end. There will be typically 25% of the pot that you can take out tax-free. Very simple run through of the rules. Stocks and shares ISAs, there's no tax relief on the way in, so you put money into the pot, like a pension, like a SIP, everything in there grows tax-free, that's income tax-free, capital gains tax-free. But with a stocks and shares ISA, when you take money out the other end, it's not taxable. You're just accessing your money. That is one of the benefits of a stocks and shares ISA. So when you look at the differences, then it may influence how you invest in those. But generally speaking, if you are in a growth phase of your investing, so you've got a long time to invest, you might be young, or you might just have a long investment time frame, maybe it's to do with retirement, or you don't have anything particular in mind that you're investing for in your stocks and shares ISA. If you have a very long time frame, then the investments held in both can be the same, and it is a reasonable thing to do. So to give you an example, if you go back to the days when I was in the city and we were giving advice to these wealthy lawyers who had huge pots of money, who they were just trying to invest and grow that money, then they weren't looking to access that money anytime soon. Then we would create these different tax pots, so stocks and shares ISAs, their pensions. We'd even have a portfolio which would be built to be able to use their CGT allowance each year in time. They wouldn't use it at that point, but the growth in time when they were coming to retirement, they need to draw down on their investments. That was the aim. We would be able to utilise their tax-free capital gains allowance. So in that instance, you can have the same portfolio in each because the time frames are identical. The reason you're investing is identical. It's just for growth. You're just trying to get your money to grow bigger and bigger. And indeed, we did do that. We would just have the same thing across, and it made it easier to manage in a way. The wrappers became slightly incidental, but the management of the funds were identical. And in fact, because the sums were so large, in those days, there was a trend to farm out some of that investment management to discretionary fund managers. That is an expensive way to manage money. You don't need to do that. Now there are far cheaper and effective ways to manage your money yourself. So that's an example where you probably don't care about the tax wrappers as such. Now, if you move on from that, if each pot, so if you had the stocks and shares ISA and the SIP, they've got different time frames, investment time frames, or there's a different purpose to them, then you might decide to start investing differently within each one. You could start to treat them as their own individual portfolios rather than as a whole. So to give you an example there, your pension won't be accessed till you're at least 55. You may be in your 30s or your 40s, and so you're going to have a 20 to 30 year time frame, possibly because you might not retire until well into your 60s. So you won't need to access your pension until then. So you may take a far greater risk on your pension. So you might invest almost exclusively in equities if you wanted. Typically, the age guide, it's sensible to have an equity allocation that's equivalent to around about 100 minus your age. So for a 40-year-old, that means you'd have about a 60% asset allocation. You might do that, but if you're investing for growth, you might be more punchy because you're not accessing it for a very long time. That's a valid approach. You might actually invest much higher amounts in equity in your portfolios. Some people might even go as high as 80, 100%. It's up to them. But on the flip side, their stocks and shares ISA portfolio that they have may be something they want to access in a much shorter time frame. So maybe after 5 years, 10 years, or they might not know that they want this portfolio, but they may need to access it at some point if something comes up that requires them to dip into that portfolio. So in that instance, you would want to try and manage the volatility of that portfolio a bit more, because you don't know exactly when you're going to dip into it. So if the equity markets are going crazy and they plummet and you have to access the money at that point, then you'll end up cashing in your portfolio, possibly at a loss, but you're actually taking out a big chunk. So when it recovers, the market recovers, then you effectively have the opposite of pound cost averaging happening when you start taking money out of your portfolio when markets are dropping. They call that pound cost ravaging, to coin a phrase. So you can see in that instance, because your portfolios are doing something different, that you could change the asset mix. And similarly, you may have junior ISAs and you're thinking, this is a long-term play. I want them to take this on beyond the junior ISA phase 18. It turns into a stocks and shares ISA maybe for them, that they continue. Then you again might be really pushing out the risk profile of your portfolio. So you can have different portfolios for each of those. That's not unusual. So again, that's another example where each pot has got a specific aim or a differing time frame around it. Now, if you think about if you're nearing retirement, that could change again. So you're getting closer to retirement, and don't forget that ISAs are tax-free when the growth of anything in your stocks and share ISA portfolio, it is liable to inheritance tax. When you look at pensions, yes, the money in there is income tax-free, it's capital gains tax-free, but it also can be inheritance tax-free. So when you've got your pensions, you won't necessarily have to pay inheritance tax on your pension because it sits outside of your estate when you die. So there is a view that one tax-efficient way of managing your money and accessing some of your money as you start to near retirement is to run down your stocks and shares ISA portfolio first, because that's the part that's in your estate. So if you do that, what you would want to do is you would want to make your stocks and shares ISA portfolio have less risk in it because of the volatility that comes with investing in high risk investments like equities. So on the flip side, because you might not decide to access your pension till a little bit later, you might be comfortable taking a little bit more risk and more equity risk in your pension. But then as you start to get older, you might start to do what they call lifestyling. That was another phrase coined by marketing people on your pension, where you start to move it from higher risk investments into lower risk investments. So you start to move towards more, or try to replicate more, what goes on with annuities, which fundamentally in their background use things like fixed interest investments, so gilts and things like that, to generate their return. But you start to de-risk your portfolio. So you can see that there isn't a simple answer to the question. It depends what you're trying to achieve. Now, if you get to the point of retirement, then you're actually drawing down income. Well, the point is, are you using drawdown? If you decide to use drawdown, then that means that your portfolio, if it's a pension, will remain invested. You may therefore decide, and it's a different in views from different people, that you want to keep around about 40% of your portfolio in equities, for example, to be able to generate that growth over time, because you're not taking all of your pension at once, you're taking it over in time in chunks. Then you may want to keep a certain amount of equity exposure in that. But similarly, you could look at it a different way. If you want your portfolio to start to generate a reliable income, I've mentioned it before, but you might start to gravitate more towards equity income funds, because over the long term, if you do the analysis and you look at the types of investments that can provide a reliable income stream over time, or a more reliable income stream, then that tends to favour equities, in particular equity income funds in the UK or globally, and that includes unit trusts and investment trusts. So your portfolio, you can see all the way through the journey that I've talked about, stages of your life, it could change considerably. And even at that retirement phase, you may have another pot that you've got another desire for, or desire to use it for. It could be to provide a deposit for your children, given that they could suddenly drop the bombshell, Dad, Mum, I want to buy a house in the next few years. You won't want to be taking too much risk with that portfolio. So the answer is, there is no hard and fast rule, but you need to make a plan. Is there a reason why you're investing? What is the time scale? And that will start to dictate it. But answering the question of diversification, there is nothing wrong with having the same portfolio effectively in different investment structures, as long as it's part of a whole and a part of a plan. but you can also view it individually. And so you therefore can hold more cash externally from your portfolios or within certain portfolios. There's a lot of people that might hold cash externally from their pensions and their stocks and shares ISAs, for example, because they might want to utilize their savings allowance that they get. That makes sense rather than having it inside a cash ISA. They might want to be trying to utilize all their different allowances. So there's a bit of financial planning going on there. Fantastic question, but hopefully I've given you some insight, things to ponder. And one other thing just to mention, when I talked about those clients we had that were very rich in the past, some of them would use things like enterprise investment schemes, or EISs. That was another string to their bow where they might invest in that over time, because it was a massive, well, still are, there's some real tax incentives of investing in that type of investment. As high rate taxpayers, that was attractive, but also in the long run that would provide a dividend income for them in retirement, so people could start to try and use their dividend allowances as well. So there's a lot of financial planning going on there, but it's a brilliant question.
Okay, moving on then. And Damien, you were inspired by listening to a book called The Richest Man in Babylon. And there are tips here on how to get rich, aren't there?
Yeah, so this book is very popular within our Facebook community. And I've read it before, but I actually recently listened to it on Audible. So, that's Amazon's audiobook platform. And it's well worth a listen. And what I wanted to do is talk to people about the lessons from that. So the way the book works, it's set up almost like a biblical story. So the language is very flowery, it's very archaic, and they tell parables about what happens to certain people, and it gives you lessons of money. It's all based around how to be rich. So the richest man in Babylon is a person, and he teaches people how to be rich and the rules of gold and the rules of money. But really what it is, it's a personal finance book that's written in a very clever and accessible way that gives you some real groundings of how to be successful with money. The book was originally published nearly 100 years ago, so it was published in 1926, and it's still relevant now with the core principles of it. So what I want to do is run through some of the key lessons that come out, some of the stories in there. And I'm not doing the book justice. It's actually part of the enjoyment of the book is the story. So I would suggest if you've got any interest in reading about books or learning more, then have a listen to it. Not all of it you will take on board or necessarily agree with it, but most of it is very good fundamentally. So some of the lessons that come from the book, one of the things they do have 7 relatively simple rules of money. And one of the rules is they use flowery language, and it's start thy purse to fattening. And basically what they mean is save money. They then talk about rule number 2, which comes down to control thy expenditure, which is, as we all know, don't spend more than you need. They talk about gold a hell of a lot in the story because obviously we didn't have Bitcoin or investment platforms back in the days that this is set, because don't forget, this is set in Babylon before Christ was even born. That's the concept. It's way back then when Babylon was this city that was the richest city in the world, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They talk about making your gold multiply, which is invest wisely. The next lesson is guide your treasures from loss, which is about avoiding investment loss, and particularly avoiding investments that sound too good to be true. So those 4 on their own are pretty sound principles, which you would have picked up over time by listening to all the podcasts that we've been doing. But as a nice summary, I think this is a good way of pulling, for those people who haven't listened to all the past podcasts, a good way of picking up some tidbits on how to manage your money. One of the ones that I quite liked, and it's coming probably more to the fore these days, is make sure you own your own home. So they say make sure your dwelling is a profitable investment. And the reason I say it's coming more to the fore is when we talked about how to become a millionaire, and you've heard me probably have mini rants almost on the podcast, is about owning assets is the way that you become rich, because they actually can grow. Your money works for you, which goes back to this idea they say in this list about make your gold multiply. When they say gold, you can think make your money up multiply. So make your investments work for you, so you earn money while you sleep. But your own home, by owning your own home, that allows you to be able to increase your wealth. It increases your family's wealth, but it gives you stability as well. So you don't have the threat of having to owe people money or potentially being kicked out of where you live. And don't forget, if you look back, and I can even say this from my own family, the ability to buy your own council house was a fundamental shift in my own family. So my parents bought their own council house when I was younger, but that knock-on effect by actually owning the house you live in does start to filter through in a generational way, because it enables you to get a footing, it enables you to be able to climb up a property ladder if you want to, but it enables you to borrow money. All these things, actually owning your own home as a fundamental principle, is pretty sound. The next one, which is one that people perhaps don't think about enough, is ensure a future income. And that is partly by investing, that's partly for saving for retirement. So in the modern day, it would be look at investing into pensions, make sure you do. But the other thing is ensure you've got an income, and it's really working on the idea of protecting yourself with insurance as well. And that's not just, I'm not talking about life insurance, just that, but it's insuring against disaster. And you've got to think about things that we've talked about on past podcasts. Go back and find when we spoke to Emma Thompson about, unfortunately, her diagnosis that she had of cancer, the impact that having insurances like critical illness can have on helping you through difficult situations. But in particular, income protection I'm talking about here, where if you're unable to work due to sickness or, say, an accident, then you can still get an income stream. And those policies are relatively affordable. They're more affordable than people think, and you're much more likely to claim on them than you are life insurance. So the final one, which I think is a key lesson, is improve your ability to learn. And that means strive to become wiser and more knowledgeable about money. I'd like to think we help on that, but it's also about you as an individual. And it's part of the story that filters through when they follow certain people, that they start to learn more about what they do, whether it's their trade or the way money works. They give an example of people who are stone cutters, and the person has to become and learn how to be the best one, how you can make more or cut more stone, like scribes in the stories, how you can write more tablets in a day and therefore increase your ability to earn. And that is by learning off other people. So your ability to earn is crucially important if you want to become rich. It's the first thing you need to do. You need to make money, earn money, that is, but you need to protect your ability to do it, because then you can then move on to the stages where you're starting to invest some of that money and making the money work for you by owning assets. Now, I'm going to go through some other lessons, which some of them filter back onto these 7, so they will pad out some of the 7 I've just mentioned. But some of the other points that I pull from the story or the book is one line where they say, it's simple to say, but many people never achieve a serious measure of wealth because they never truly seek it, focus on it, and commit to it. And again, this goes back to things that we talk about on the MOT, or anything we've talked about on the Millionaire podcast with how you can make your child a millionaire. It's about, if you really want it, you have to have a plan, and you have to stick to that plan, and you have to commit to it. Very few people do it by luck unless you commit to it and you have a plan. It's one of those things you're going to get rich slowly, going back to the point of don't take excess risk, protect your money from needless loss by investing on things on YouTube or Instagram. I mean, it's quite interesting. They talk about not taking advice from people who don't know what they're talking about in terms of money. But in the modern day, we get lots of that. We're having this whole movement and people basically getting exploited online, and they're investing. Unfortunately, I don't want to I'm not tiring a generation, but younger people are getting a lot more of their investment advice, in inverted commas, from online platforms, which is from people who are pushing things that they're benefiting from. And it's not based on fundamentally sound principles. And there is one of the stories in this book, they talk about, do not take advice from a bricklayer on finance. Go to people who are experts in a particular subject if you want expert advice. It's easy for amateurs to give out advice. And that is based on Babylon, the story, but it's very relevant about TikTok, about YouTube, all these things. I see so many people who are giving advice about investing. If you want advice on building a house, or you go to a bricklayer, a builder, but if you want advice on money, then go to somebody who's good at it. And that does mean sometimes you need to seek financial advice. There are times when you can find the information from somebody who's an expert, and you don't need the advice because the tools are out there, and perhaps this podcast is one of those such places. One of the other key messages that comes from the book is that you only begin to build wealth when you start to realize that part of all the money you earn is yours to keep. And that means to pay yourself first. That's something we talked about on the podcast previously. And they put a number on it. They say pay yourself as much as you can, save money, and you should save at least 1/10 of what you earn for yourself. And that is whatever's going on. Even if you're trying to pay down debt, you should try and save 1/10 of whatever you earn, because as soon as you start to create a pot of money that is yours, you will look after it, and you'll go down that road and begin on that path to accrue wealth. And actually they go further and talk about debt. And bearing in mind this was 100 years ago, and consumer debt wasn't really a thing. at that point. But they're saying if you're in debt, then you should live on 70% of what you make, save 10% for yourself, and use the remaining 20% to repay your debt. So we've talked about various principles like the 50-30-20 principle, which again, you can go back and find on previous podcast episodes. But as a general rule, it makes sense. And let's be honest, the church, why does the church want people to give 10% of their money to the church as a donation? Because fundamentally, it's a way to make money and get rich over time. So I like the concept. And also what I think it adds a bit of flexibility and gives people something to think about, where we always try and strive for the optimum. And on podcast 315, I said about breaking golden rules. And sometimes it's okay if it increases your chance of success. Interestingly, this book is effectively saying a similar thing, because saying pay down your debt, but save yourself the 10%, because you need to break the behavior of relying on debt. You need to start to try and build wealth as well, which you then eventually get to rely on, because you eventually pay back your debt. If you follow the plan, your 20% will pay back the debt, and eventually you'll have this pot of money that grows over time through the powers of compounding. So the exact numbers aren't necessarily important, but the concept is. Don't spend your money as soon as you earn it. So basically, don't always live to your means. Do try and save a portion of your money as you can. We all very readily get a pay rise, start spending more, and before we know it, we wonder, where's all the money gone, and we need another pay rise. Enjoy life while you can, and you don't need to overstrain to save. So again, try and be realistic about what you're trying to do. Surround yourself with people who are familiar with money, who work with it each day, and who make lots of it. So I suppose even the modern take on that, you hear these principles of surrounding yourself with the sort of people that you want to be. You're the average of so many of your friends. Isn't your closest 5 friends, you're the average of them. So again, if growing wealth is important to you, then there's a view, which is from this book, that you surround yourself with people who have a similar mindset. They're not necessarily spending all their money frivolously. Don't confuse your necessary expenses with your desires. So the things you've got to pay, like your bills, don't confuse that with the things that you want. So your discretionary spend. Increase your ability to earn, improve your skills, learn as you perfect, like I said before, your craft or whatever it is. Then you increase your ability to earn more money, which then feeds into the whole plan. One of the lines I quite liked was, you cannot arrive at the fullest measure of your success until you crush the spirit of procrastination within you, which is one thing we talked about, I think, last week on the podcast, which is how to beat that. So you can see the book is interesting. It pulls together a lot of nice ideas. Not all of them you'll agree with, but if you are wanting to listen to something else that is a bit different, but there's some good lessons. If you don't want to listen to it, you don't need to, because I've just told you the key bits from it. But I think it's a nice lesson on how to get rich. It's boring. It's a process. You just have to stick to it.
Okay, so that moves us on to the final piece of the podcast, and it's just a quick one really on the government's new scheme. It's called the Breathing Space Debt Respite Scheme, to give it its full name, and it is now open to anyone who is struggling to repay their debt from the 4th of May 2021. So it's been designed to help those that are struggling with what is considered to be problem debt, and according to the gov.uk website, these debts that qualify for the Breathing Space Scheme include credit and store cards, personal and payday loans, overdrafts, utility bills, rent and mortgage arrears, and even government debts like tax and benefits. So, for example, universal credit overpayments will also be included in the scheme for those who are struggling to repay. So just to explain what this Breathing Space Scheme is, it's a new debt respite scheme that the government have thought up to help people in England and Wales who are struggling with the mounting debt. And it gives those that are struggling up to 60 days of legal protection from their creditors. Now, what that means is there'll be no interest and no penalty charges to pay. They will be frozen, and any enforcement action will be halted as well. So hopefully these people who are really calling out for help won't have people hammering down the door, because they'll be legally protected on that basis. It goes one stage further for those that are not only struggling from problem debt, but also those that are struggling, in addition, a mental health crisis. And what that means is those people who are struggling a mental health crisis will reach out for help, and this scheme will kick in, and it will continue to be in place for the duration of the crisis treatment, plus an additional 30 days at the end once the mental health crisis has concluded. So those struggling in that area will have a mental health professional that will be able to help them through this process. They can even help the individual who's struggling with debt concerns to fill out the application forms necessary and to speak to the debt advice provider on their behalf to consider and make sure that they're definitely eligible for the scheme. In terms of applying for the Breathing Space scheme, you should use a well-known debt charity, debt specialist. Stepchange.org, for example, are a debt charity, and they'll be able to help you with free, confidential, expert advice and money guidance, and certainly be able to help you on the application process of the Breathing Space scheme. And we'll link to a couple of other articles, including the Breathing Space scheme, which was brilliantly written by Bronte. Things like where you can get free debt advice and simple tricks you can do to repay your debt quicker. So that's it. We're done, I think.
Yeah, so all that will be in the show notes, which you can look at after the show. So we're done, Andy. So as usual, do please leave us a review. If you want to email in, but particularly if you want to put it on the podcast app of your choice that you use, that really helps us, and it's incredibly motivating as well. So if you could leave us a glowing 5-star review, then who knows, you may even get a Money to the Masses mug. And don't forget, if you think you've ever done something mug worthy, then do write in, because we do have mugs that we are sending out to people who have done something that we deem mug worthy, which could be you just telling the world about how great this podcast is and how much you enjoy it. And don't forget, the Money to the Masses mugs are something of a must-have item.
That's right, and we've got those winging their way to some people today, actually. I've seen them being wrapped up in the office. So if you want to contact Damien on that, you can do so. Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Also, you can contact Damien on Twitter in the usual ways, at moneytothemasses with the number 2. So that's it, we're done. Until next time.
Until next time.